I beg you, please. Your father and your brother are all here. Think of your wife and children. Think of your family. Please come out. I promise you that not a hair on your head will be harmed. Come out into the yard, raise your hands, take off your jacket, and show them that you're not wearing a bomb belt. Just walk slowly towards our people and let them search you. Do you understand me? Jakub, come out, please.
A former minister of the Republic of Ingushetia appeals to his son Jakub, who refuses to listen as his father urges him to surrender. He would soon be killed in a shootout with special forces. Ingushetia in the northern Caucasus is the smallest and youngest republic of the Russian Federation. For the past 20 years, Ingushetia has lived through several conflicts, anti-terror operations, and a string of retaliations. Terrorists fought to create an Islamic State that would be called the Caucasus Emirate. Young people are lured into the woods with promises of a ticket to paradise, when in reality, they're trained to become terrorists and suicide bombers. At the age of 18, Musa Palankoyev went into the woods to join the militants. This is the first time Musa has seen his mother since he voluntarily surrendered himself. She hasn't seen him for 2 years.
You've gotten so thin. I didn't believe it until the end, until I saw him on TV, showing that he'd surrendered. I was so happy that he'd come back, that he had given himself up.
Personally, I didn't want to kill anyone. There was some misunderstanding about that. They argued about who should be killed, but I didn't want to do that. I clearly remember one time when they were talking about it. I wasn't standing far from them, and at that moment, I started thinking about how to escape from them as quickly as possible.
He talks quietly, and his speech is a little slurred. His eyes dart around. Psychologists believe that Musa exhibits the classic signs of autism. Back in the woods, he was only trusted with menial tasks. The only way he could earn the respect of his comrades was to become a suicide bomber. Once he returned home from the woods, Musa cut his hair and took off his camouflage uniform. His mother was relieved. Musa grew up and lived most of his life without his father, who was sent to prison for murder. He says that he used to watch Islamic videos on the internet. He became obsessed with the subject and began to look for people who could introduce him to militant groups.
One day I met some people when I went to the mosque. I asked them if they had any connections with the fighters in the forest. They said nothing at first, but later when they saw that I didn't go anywhere and didn't give them away, they told me there might be some options.
Musa did make his way into the woods, despite the fact that joining illegal paramilitary groups can be punished with up to 5 years in prison.
I wanted to go there 1,000 times, just to grab my son and take him away from the woods. I thought about it day and night. It made my hair turn gray. I just couldn't think of anything else.
Sonia Zetova is yet another mother who lost her son to the forest. Not long ago, Arsen was studying to become a lawyer. He had a bright future ahead of him. One day, though, he simply didn't come home.
I came home from work in the evening. He hadn't answered his phone since lunch. And in the evening, they brought me a note from him that read, "Mom, I'm sorry, I've left. I couldn't do anything else." It was like a bombshell. His friends gave me that note at around 8 o'clock in the evening. The state I was in is beyond description. It was horrible. What could I do? Where do they go? They usually go to the village of Arshti from here.
Arshti is a small village in the mountain forest. It's very easy to break away from here unnoticed and return from the mountains by the many small paths that bypass the checkpoints. It was here that Sonia's friends saw her son Arsen on the day he disappeared.
I began to look for him very early the next morning. While garlic was in season, the locals harvested at that time of the year. So I pretended to be looking for garlic and went into the woods. I was terrified, of course. I tried to pass a message to my son. I told him, I'm in the woods now and I won't go away until you come out. If he wanted me to die, he could stay where he was. It was late March, it was really cold, and I fell seriously ill.
Arsen had a personal reason for escaping into the woods. The militant group he joined was headed by the person closest to him after his mother.
My uncle was leading the group I joined. I had admired my uncle ever since I was a little boy. I tried to be like him, perhaps even for the reasons that he was there. We kept in touch from time to time through social networks. At one point, he told me to come to his home just to see him. We met a couple of times, and then I followed him into the woods.
It's hard to refuse when your closest relatives ask you to do something. If it hadn't been for his mother, Arsen would certainly have stayed in the woods, perhaps forever.
Word travels quickly. Locals told me that my mother had been searching for me in the woods for more than 2 weeks and that she had some serious health problems. As soon as I found out about that, I tried to get in touch with her. I didn't have any means of communication. I didn't have a phone, but I managed to find one.
He sent a message to my phone number. Mom, I will come out at 12.
She came in a taxi by herself. She was totally depressed and looked as though she'd been crying.
As we were leaving Arshti village, we saw a column of tanks heading towards it. There was a long line of vehicles, so many. They were still moving the next morning when they launched a special operation and bombed the whole group. They killed almost everybody. Yet I had been able to take him away from there. Maybe that was just good chance. I don't know.
Arsen went on to finish college. He moved to Moscow, found a job and got married. A baby girl was born. But it wasn't easy to forget his past. Arsen was arrested in Moscow because of a photograph taken in 2009, in which he's seen in the woods carrying arms. He spent several months in prison during the investigation. Arsen was found guilty and given a 5.5-year suspended sentence.
I got 3 years on probation, so if during these 3 years, with God's help, everything goes well, my criminal record will be cleared. I need to find a job now. It doesn't matter what kind of work. Anything will do. I hope there's a chance, with God's help, that I'll start working soon.
In 2011, Ingushetia introduced a special new program intended to reintegrate former members of armed militant groups into society. People who have never been involved in murder or other serious crimes can be granted immunity from prosecution. They're then given help to find new jobs, even though the official unemployment rate stands at 49%.
If we did have work, there wouldn't be so many people here. The majority is out of work. They just live off the land.
What do people do? Well, they sell what they've got. There's almost no work. I'm out of work myself.
That's not true. If you want to work, you'll find a way.
Musa Palankayev, who had just escaped from the terrorist camp, was also promised a job.
How's your son? Still fooling around?
No, everything's fine now.
Home is home.
What are you doing?
I'm going to find a job somewhere.
Where?
He'll work at a construction site for now. When I saw him on TV, I couldn't see his face, only the back of his head. And I still recognize my boy instantly. What matters most is that I didn't lose him forever. Poverty isn't the end. You can make some money and everything can be put right as long as you don't lose your soul.
One element of the rehabilitation is regular visits to a local mosque under the supervision of a police officer. Every Friday afternoon, the faithful will stop whatever they're doing for an hour and a half and get together for obligatory prayers. They use the central mosque in the area where they live. The latest news is always discussed before prayers begin. Once inside the mosque, everyone considers themselves face to face with Allah.
14 centuries ago, our prophet predicted that the time would come when children would disobey their parents. Now, our children say that the parents don't understand Islam and have diverted from it. The children say that we abandoned Islam during the communist era. The children cannot be blamed for this. It is the fault of their parents, the parents who failed to pass on parts of their own upbringing and education to their children. These parents did not teach their children how to be true Muslims.
With the collapse of the Soviet Union, many Muslims of the North Caucasus began to return to Islamic values. There was a shortage of the people and funding needed to establish proper centers for faith education. The religious vacuum was soon filled by charity foundations from countries where Wahhabi Islam still underpins ideology. There are almost 6,000 such organizations in Saudi Arabia alone. They're characterized by calling on the faithful to take up arms and fight for the purity of Islam. They believe that no state can be secular, and anyone who recognizes an authority other than Allah is declared an enemy.
They aim to recruit young people and encourage them not to study Islam, but to rise in rebellion. They say, if you rise up, everything will be in order. But it doesn't work that way. That's not how order is established.
Anastasia Alexieva spent almost a year with militants. She was on the federal wanted list. She left the woods during the 9th month of her pregnancy. She went to live with her husband, who was the leader of an illegal paramilitary gang.
He's an alert boy, very active.
She surrendered herself voluntarily. He did not. She was cleared of criminal charges. He wasn't. Today she receives an allowance for bringing up her child. She's moved from her old shabby house into a new apartment.
I'm raising my child alone. He doesn't have a father. Of course it would be better if he did, but it worked out this way, and I can't change that. I have to move on. Now I have someone to live for. I'm bringing up my son.
Anastasia was very young when her father died. Though her mother was Russian, she had no choice about what religion to follow. Islam was her only option. She always knew she'd missed out on her father's affection. She married early and says she loved her husband and shared his values.
I became attached to him. I couldn't imagine living without him. So, as I was leaving, I thought of nothing else. I didn't think about my relatives, nothing at all. I just wanted to be with him. And as soon as I left, I began to realize that what I had done was wrong. He used to tell me that it was the duty of every Muslim to take part in the jihad and glorify the religion of Islam. He said he wouldn't stay here. He had already chosen that path, so there was no talking him out of it. He was very firm.
Abdul Malik was born 1 month before his father died in a shootout with police officers. 4 other militants died with him. They all wore suicide belts and carried a whole stash of explosives.
He was a good man, and I became attached to him. He wasn't rude or anything. He was a good man and always kind to everybody. He tried to help people. He did this for these people and that for those people.
Anastasia's good man, Timur Khayaouri, was on the federal wanted list. He was eventually found guilty of taking part in several crimes, which included killing servicemen and police officers. Anastasia isn't yet ready to tell Abdul Malik about his father.
I don't know, I don't even think about it. I can tell my baby about his father when he grows up a little, when he's 3 or 4, when children start understanding these things.
Zainab Ugochieva lost 2 of her sons in one night. Both were policemen. It was in 2004 when armed terrorists attacked police checkpoints and armories throughout the Republic and in the city of Nazran.
This is all that has left from my sons and husband. These are my boys and my husband.
It was her youngest son who had to deliver the terrible news.
Ibrahim came to me in the morning. I told him to tell me everything, to conceal nothing from his mother. I asked him what happened. He said, "Mom, I don't know for sure, but it seems that Rustam and Adam have been killed." Then my father came to me. He said, "Zainab, this is hard to have to say. You know now that your sons have been killed. You have already endured this. Be strong because Behan has also been killed." We buried all 3 of them like that. 2 brothers in one grave. They're all lying close to each other. We have to live with this pain and grief.
Several years later, police officers again came under attack. The Internal Affairs Department was blown up in Nazran. More than 20 people were killed and 130 injured. It was later discovered that these terror attacks were organized by Ali Taziev, the commander of the criminal paramilitary units from the so-called Caucasus Emirate. As a former policeman himself, he knew the strongest and weakest points of law enforcement agencies. There was a long manhunt, but eventually he was found. Among the many charges was attempting to kill the head of the Republic, Yunusbek Yevkurov. 2 bodyguards died, while Yevkurov himself suffered multiple injuries and burns. They met again in the law courts in 2013, where Yevkurov was summoned as a witness.
I never did harm to any man. I beg for pardon, inshallah. I beg for pardon before Allah.
Even if you have done no harm, You must still repent for not having done good.
We're not against Sharia. We follow the Quran and the Sunnah. Anyone who's against that are enemies of Islam, not my enemies.
But if you all just hide behind Islam and blow people up, killing them, and try to cover it up with Islam, is that not against Islam?
Taziev's arrest almost certainly encouraged more militants to leave the woods. In 2 years, 54 people voluntarily surrendered.
I've always said this, 99% of the work is prevention. It includes negotiations and making requests. There's nothing wrong with the authorities asking and trying to convince criminals to stop what they're doing. If he surrenders because of these negotiations, it can only be for the better. It means the authorities worked well. We have a rule that was introduced here preventing anyone who has surrendered their arms from ever working for law enforcement bodies. He will never work with weapons. It's forbidden. He won't be drafted into the army. He won't be asked to repay his debts with blood.
In 2013, the police saw their first calm day in many years. The day's report read no incidents for 24 hours. So far, there's been only one such report.
They're kids. They were cheated. Now they're recovering their senses. They start thinking about themselves, about their families, about their parents. Things are returning to normal. People start traveling, which they didn't do before, because they were scared that militants would come out of the woods.
Musa Polankoyev's criminal prosecution was brought to an end. He will be under the constant supervision of his neighborhood police officer for 2 years, and he will not be allowed to cross the Republic's borders.
Before I went into the woods, I wondered for a long time if life in there was, as they said. I was satisfied here, with school and everything else. It was just that I couldn't decide what I really wanted.
There, with other militants in the woods, he'd given up hope of ever walking with his brother to go to the river.
A lot of changes have taken place since then, and everyone's grown up. My friends used to look different. To tell you the truth, I couldn't even recognize my own brother.
Today, Musa is simply able to watch the water, waiting only for fish to bite, instead of gunfire and explosions. Not long ago, he might have made a very different choice.
Allah has offered us a deal. We sacrifice our souls. In exchange for that, Allah admits us to paradise.
This is an anti-tank shrapnel mine. I use a lot of everything. There are lots of ball bearings and screws. Here, I'll show them to the camera. You see? Just like that.
This suicide bomber is the son of a former head of police. He used to work for the police himself. He blew himself up at a neighborhood police officer's funeral. 7 people were killed. He was decapitated by the blast. Early suspicions in the investigation pointed to another man, Lyubov Aldieva's son. In these photographs, he's in the woods carrying a gun and wearing camouflage. He was on the run for 18 months.
They brought everybody together at the school and said that Hamzat Aldiev had killed 7 people, that 15 were badly injured. I said, he couldn't have done that. They showed me a picture on a mobile phone. the head of a man that had blown himself up. And I said, "That's not my son. That's not him."
Khamzat's mother even took a DNA test to see if it was actually her son who'd blown himself up. 2 days later, the authorities formally apologized for their mistake, but reminded her they were still searching for Khamzat.
Him. The FSB showed us that photo too. Khamzat, if you have even the slightest chance, come back. I have become ill because of you. I've developed diabetes and my blood pressure is now very high. I beg you to come back. Since you left, my blood sugar levels are dangerously high. Please, come back. Nobody here is gonna harm you. You won't go to prison.